Hello everyone. Welcome to week 1 of our course. Week 1, it should be noted, is a rather abbreviated week. It begins on Thursday, April 10th, and it ends at 11:59 p.m. on Saturday, April 12th. So there's only a few days in week 1 of the course. For that reason, the assignments for this week are rather abbreviated. The only assignments are to complete the reading, the assigned reading, and to participate in the 2 discussion board posts. One discussion board question deals with the age of exploration, and a second discussion board question addresses the early struggles of the Jamestown colony. I would like to just introduce these topics a bit in this short video introduction. Please remember, for the discussion boards, you are asked to post your own initial response to the question, as well as a minimum of 2 responses to others' comments. So you should make a total of 3 posts for each discussion question. Also, please note, you won't be able to see your other classmates' comments until you complete your own initial post. So if you're wondering why there's no comments there, that's generally the reason. All of the posts need to be completed by Saturday, April 12th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. I've really enjoyed reading all of your introductions in the icebreaker, and I look forward to working with you all this semester. Now, the age of exploration, what we are examining here, really begins with Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492. Christopher Columbus had participated in explorations of the coast of Africa. He served as a navigator on Portuguese ships that were sailing around the west coast of Africa. The Portuguese were trying to circumnavigate or sail around Africa in order to reach Asia and engage in trade with Asia. The Portuguese felt that trade with Asia would be incredibly profitable, and that they were pursuing this path of sailing all the way around the continent of Africa. Christopher Columbus hit upon a rather interesting idea. Everyone who was educated in Europe at this time knew that the Earth was a sphere, that it was, roughly speaking, round. Columbus suggested, if we sail far enough west, eventually we'll reach the far east. If the Earth is a sphere, Columbus said, if I sail west into the Atlantic Ocean, eventually I will reach Asia. Columbus underestimated the size of the Earth. He thought the Earth was only about 2/3 as large as it actually was, and therefore he believed that this voyage going west towards the far east would only take approximately 6 weeks. He pitched this idea to the Portuguese monarchy, and they were not interested. He then pitched the idea to the Spanish monarchy, and King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella agreed to sponsor this voyage of exploration. And of course, this would have dramatic consequences for the entire world, really. So in 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, as you're likely familiar, and ultimately reached the islands in the Caribbean. Of course, initially he thought that he had reached the Indies. He thought he reached Asia, but this proved not to be the case. Columbus established a base on the island that he called Hispaniola. He actually left behind a small group of Europeans on the island, went back to and he also encountered Native American peoples there. He encountered a Native American group known as the Arawak. The first thing that Columbus commented upon was that the Arawak were wearing gold ornamentation, gold jewelry, you might say, around their necks and in their ears and on their hands and wrists. He also commented in his report to Ferdinand and Isabella that they were rather lightly armed, that their weapons consisted of stone and wooden spears, essentially. This is an alarming report from Columbus. What it suggests is, from the very beginning, Columbus and the Europeans intended to conquer the territory that they encountered, the islands of the Caribbean, and this in fact proved to be true. On his second voyage, Columbus returned with many ships and 1,200 armed men, and essentially conquered the island of Hispaniola. The native peoples were treated quite brutally by Columbus and his soldiers, if you will. Natives were forced to gather gold for the Spanish. Those who failed to turn over gold to the Spanish would often have their hands cut off very brutally. And large numbers of native peoples were killed as a result. It was quite horrific. Another thing that the Spanish brought with them, in this case inadvertently, was disease. The native peoples had been separated from the peoples of Europe, Africa, and Asia for thousands of years, since the last ice age. And as a result, there were separate disease cultures in the Americas and in Europe, Africa, Asia, in the New World and the Old World. So when Europeans came to the Americas, they brought with them a variety of diseases that the Native Americans had never encountered before. The most devastating proved to be smallpox. Now, most of us are probably not very familiar with smallpox because it's largely been wiped out across the globe. In fact, if you are, say, under the age of 40, you probably haven't been vaccinated unless you've been in the military or traveled to certain parts of the world. Smallpox really devastated the native population. It's a disease that's related to chickenpox, but much more severe when it breaks out in blister-like sores all over the body. And most natives who contracted smallpox would die from the disease. Natives had also never encountered influenza, typhus, and a variety of other European diseases, which spread like wildfire through the native population. And by 1700, 90% of the Native American population was dead. When Europeans first arrived in the New World in 1492, it's estimated that there were approximately 10 million native peoples living in the Americas. By 1700, the estimate is that there are only about 1 million natives left alive. This wasn't the result primarily of warfare, although that played a role. It was primarily a result of the spread of such diseases. Now, after the Spanish conquered huge parts of the Americas, they wanted to profit from the Americas through mining for gold and silver and other gems at times, and also through plantation agriculture. The Caribbean islands and other parts of Latin America were very well suited to growing sugarcane, which was incredibly valuable in Europe. There are very few parts of Europe that had the proper climate to grow sugarcane. And as a result, the Europeans set out to establish these mining and agrarian operations in the Americas. They tried initially to enslave the native peoples, but they found that they encountered great difficulties in trying to do so. One, so many of the natives were dying from disease. And secondly, natives often could escape into the interior, into the forests, and reunite with their native peoples, native tribes. So they're very difficult to control. Meanwhile, remember, the Europeans had been exploring the coast of Africa. And the combination of the exploration of the coast of Africa and the conquest of the Americas would lead to one of the most horrible events in American history, the slave trade. Slavery had existed in West Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans. It was very different in form from what the Europeans would implement. But the African peoples were familiar with the concept of holding an individual in bondage. There were a variety of different African peoples who spoke many different languages. They weren't one united people, certainly. So as the Europeans traveled and engaged in trade along the west coast of Africa, they began to, by 1500, request to purchase human beings. Individuals were enslaved in Africa largely through warfare. As a result of war, prisoners of war would be taken. And these prisoners of war, these people who were kidnapped essentially, began to be sold to Europeans along the coast. So Europeans would arrive in the coastal ports, they would meet with African merchants, and they would offer various goods like firearms, cloth, manufactured goods, tools, steel implements, and they would ask the African merchants in exchange for human beings, for slaves. This contributed to the outbreak of massive warfare in West Africa. The peoples who lived along the coast began to have a tremendous military advantage over the people who lived in the hundreds of miles in the interior. The African peoples along the coast now had European weapons, firearms, steel weapons, steel armor. They used these weapons to attack peoples in the interior who they considered to be foreign peoples, people who spoke different languages, weren't of the same ethnic group. They took them prisoner, the African armies and merchants, and then transported them back to the coast and sold them to Europeans. Europeans packed Africans very tightly into ships in horrific conditions and transported them to the Americas for sale to plantation owners largely as slave labor. It's estimated that 20 million Africans were taken, and that ultimately 10 million survived the voyage to the Americas, that roughly half died en route, which suggests the level of the horrific nature of this trade and the grand scale of the atrocities that occurred. Of course, it was more profitable to pack large numbers of people into the ships, and for profit, Europeans did this horrific trade. Now, the British came over and tried to establish colonies in North America as well. The first efforts of the British to establish a colony in Roanoke failed. The Roanoke colony in the late 16th century literally disappeared. European settlers established a colony in Roanoke in what today would be North Carolina, and the colony simply vanished. No one knows what happened to the people who settled there, which suggests the danger that existed. The first successful British North American colony was established by a private corporation called the Virginia Company, which received a charter from the King of England. The Virginia Company sent slightly over 100 men and boys to colonial North America, to what today would be Virginia. They established a colony known as Jamestown. Jamestown was located in an area that wasn't inhabited by natives. The reason it wasn't inhabited by natives was that it was a swamp. The water was brackish and impure, and it was not an ideal place for settlement. The reason the English settled there was because it was off the coast a bit. They feared Spanish attack. They didn't want to be right on the coast. And there weren't any natives on the land, so they didn't have to fight to acquire the land initially. The English established a fort at Jamestown, a walled-in community, to protect themselves from potential native attack, was the idea. And they began to search for gold and silver. That's why they came, to make a quick profit and leave. You notice there are no women who traveled over. They're not thinking of establishing a permanent colony in 1607 at Jamestown. They just want to make a lot of money from gold and silver and leave and go back to England. They discover, though, there in fact is very little gold and silver in the area. They don't find any, in fact, and they suffer massively. Drinking the brackish water, they're actually poisoned. Salt water poisoning takes place. They run out of food, and their relationship with the local native peoples becomes hostile fairly quickly. So they very quickly can't acquire food from the native peoples. Instead of focusing on growing their own food, they're focusing mostly on searching for gold and silver, and as a result, you have the starving time, where literally large numbers of the settlers at Jamestown starved to death. They even resorted to cannibalism, of consuming the flesh of the dead in order to try to survive. It's quite remarkable that the Jamestown colony actually did survive, in fact. Ultimately, they would find that the source of wealth in the New World was not gold and silver, at least not at Jamestown and Virginia. They would engage in tobacco cultivation, which would be incredibly profitable and would lead the straight to the slave trade. I look forward to working with you during this unit.